Have you ever wondered how a nation that was financially broken, politically humiliated, and economically paralyzed managed to build the deadliest war machine in modern history? Before we dive into this unbelievable transformation, let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because your support helps bring deep, factual history to life. Most people imagine Adolf Hitler rising to power and immediately unleashing a fully armed, industrially invincible Germany upon Europe. But this is a myth that oversimplifies one of the most astonishing financial engineering feats of the 20th century. When Hitler became Chancellor in January 1933, Germany was not a powerhouse. It was a nation on the brink of collapse. Its currency had once evaporated into useless paper during the hyperinflation of 1923, millions wandered the streets, desperate for work. Major industries were shutting down, foreign investment had dried up to almost nothing, and the Treaty of Versailles had ensured that Germany was militarily paralyzed by strict limits on soldiers, weapons, and production. So how does a nation in this condition, barely able to feed its own people, suddenly produce tanks, planes, submarines, battleships, rockets, autobombs, and an army capable of conquering half of Europe in less than 2 years? That question has mystified audiences for decades. Many understand Hitler's ideology, fewer understand his economy. And yet, behind every tank factory and every invasion was a web of hidden financial mechanisms so complex, so bold, and in many cases so illegal, that historians today still debate the brilliance and the brutality of the strategy. To understand the Nazi war machine, we must start with the truth Germany tried to hide. The country was broke. Deeply broke. So broke that traditional methods of financing war were impossible. A normal government relies on taxes, borrowing, or printing money. Germany had already exhausted the printing press in the 1920s, leaving psychological scars on the population. Borrowing was impossible because no one trusted the German government. Tax revenue was too low because the economy was dead. The Nazi regime could not fund a cup of coffee with what they inherited from the Weimar Republic, let alone rearmament. And yet, within just a few years, unemployment virtually vanished, factories roared to life, and the world watched, shocked, as Germany produced tanks, aircraft, artillery, munitions, and the infamous Luftwaffe. It seemed like magic. It wasn't. It was something far more dangerous, a calculated illusion, built on secret credit, manipulated markets, political intimidation, and a complete disregard for future consequences. Let's step into that world. As you listen, imagine yourself walking through Germany in 1933. Moving past silent factories and struggling families, imagine how hopeless it looked. Then, imagine that within a handful of years, those same empty streets are filled with marching soldiers, armored vehicles, and the mechanical hum of war industries. That transformation did not happen by chance. It was engineered. Hitler's first major move was psychological, not financial. He understood something critical. A population in despair cannot build an empire. So one of the earliest Nazi objectives was restoring confidence. The speeches, the rallies, the propaganda, these weren't mere theatrics. They were economic weapons. When a country believes tomorrow will be better, spending rises, investment rises, and unemployment falls, confidence is the invisible fuel of every economy. And Hitler mastered the manipulation of it. But confidence alone cannot build tanks. And that brings us to the mastermind behind the financial resurrection of Germany, Hjalmar Schacht, a man often forgotten by the general public, yet undeniably one of the most influential economic minds of the century. Schacht was not a Nazi ideologue. He did not share the party's radical views, but he was a nationalist, and he saw in Hitler someone who could restore Germany's pride. More importantly, Schacht saw a challenge that would define his name in history: how to fund a massive military buildup with no money. So, Schacht engineered a financial weapon that could only exist in a nation under totalitarian control, a weapon called Mefo Bills. These bills are one of the most fascinating and misunderstood financial instruments in history. At their core, Mefo Bills were promissory notes, essentially IOUs. Issued not by the German government, but by a fake company created solely for this purpose. This company, called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO, didn't produce anything. It had no employees, no offices, no factories. It existed only on paper. Yet it became the engine driving Germany's rearmament. Here's how it worked. When companies produced weapons, equipment, or military infrastructure, instead of being paid with government money, they received Mefo bills. These could be exchanged for cash at the Reichsbank, but companies usually held on to them because they earned interest and were guaranteed by the government. This system hid billions of Reichsmarks of military expenditure from the public, from foreign governments, and even from Germany's own financial institutions. It kept the budget looking clean, while factories worked around the clock building weapons. Pause and reflect for a moment. This means Germany was not paying for its military buildup with real money. It was paying with promises backed by nothing but confidence and secrecy. Imagine building an entire house on credit cards nobody knows about. That was Hitler's economic strategy, powerful, risky, and destined to collapse. Unless war came first. I want to ask you something. Do you think this kind of hidden financing could work in today's world? Let me know in the comments. Secret off-the-books credit funding a nation's military. Does this sound familiar in any modern geopolitical situations? But Mefo bills alone couldn't fill factories with raw materials. Germany lacked almost everything needed for war: oil, rubber, steel, copper, tin, and even food supplies. The country's resources were insufficient, and foreign currency reserves were tiny. Germany couldn't simply import everything because it didn't have the money to pay, so the Nazis turned to a second strategy: barter. This was one of the most brilliant and yet most desperate solutions in Nazi economic policy. Instead of buying goods with cash they didn't have, they negotiated trade deals where Germany exchanged industrial products directly for raw materials from countries in Eastern Europe and Latin America. These were not equal deals. Germany manipulated smaller economies, pressuring them into lopsided agreements where the Reich paid with overvalued manufactured goods and sometimes paid so slowly that the value eroded by the time payment arrived. This system allowed Germany to secure resources without spending foreign currency, while simultaneously binding smaller countries into economic dependence. When a nation becomes economically dependent, political dependence often follows. And this, in turn, became one of the subtle forces behind Germany's early expansion. But still, trade wasn't enough. Germany needed far more raw materials than barter could provide. So Hitler moved toward something more ambitious: economic autarky. The Nazis launched massive programs to produce synthetic fuel, synthetic rubber, buna, and other key materials domestically. German scientists worked day and night to create substitutes for strategic resources. These efforts were expensive, inefficient, and sometimes barely effective, but they allowed Germany to bypass blockades and shortages, giving the regime a crucial advantage when war began. Now pause for a moment. Think about this. Germany was a country with almost no oil, yet by 1939, it was running a modern mechanized military. Because it manufactured petroleum out of coal using hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch methods, these synthetic fuel plants were among the most important and most bombed targets during the war, and their existence shows just how far Nazi Germany went in bending science and industry toward war. But raw materials and secret credits still weren't enough. Hitler needed something more dramatic: control. Total control. And that brings us to the third pillar of his economic transformation: compulsion. When you cannot afford to motivate a nation with money, you motivate it with force. The Nazis did not hesitate to pressure, intimidate, or outright seize industries. Businesses were told what to produce, how much, and at what price. Labor unions were dismantled. Strikes were outlawed. Wages were frozen. Prices were fixed. Every aspect of the economy was placed under government command, all under the promise of national revival. Employment rose not because the economy was naturally healing, but because millions were artificially funneled into massive state-sponsored projects, stadiums, military factories, and compulsory labor programs. This is where many people misunderstand the German economic miracle. It wasn't a miracle, it was mobilization. A peacetime economy forced into a wartime structure, and like all forced systems, it worked only as long as opposition was brutally suppressed. Let me ask you something. If you lived in Germany in 1934 and suddenly had a job after years of unemployment, would you question how the government achieved it? Many didn't. The immediate relief blinded millions to the long-term consequences. By 1936, the truth was becoming impossible to hide. Military spending was exploding. The internal demand for resources was overwhelming. Inflation pressures were rising. And those secret Mefo Bills, they were coming due. Billions of marks in hidden debt were hanging over the economy. If confidence cracked, if factories demanded cash, or if creditors panicked, the entire system would collapse overnight. This tension between illusion and reality pushes us toward one of the most important turning points in Nazi economic history, the 4-year plan. But before we dive into that, I want you to think about something carefully, because your perspective matters. Do you think Hitler understood the economic disaster he was building? Or do you think he believed the illusion would last? Tell me in the comments below. Your insights help shape the depth of our next video, as pressure mounted. The Nazi leadership made a fateful decision. Instead of slowing down rearmament, they would accelerate it. Instead of reducing spending, they would spend more. Instead of making peace with the economic limits of Germany, they would declare war on those limits, pushing industry, science, agriculture, and labor to the edge of collapse. This is where part 1 ends, not with an answer, but with a revelation. By 1936, Germany was running an economy that could only survive if it kept expanding. And expansion meant one thing: war was no longer a political choice. It was becoming an economic necessity. By 1936, the German economy was straining under the weight of its own illusions. The factories were producing, the propaganda was shining, and the people believed recovery had arrived. But beneath the surface, the financial system trembled. Germany was like a man sprinting full speed across a frozen lake, praying the ice would hold. Every new tank, every new aircraft, every new Autobahn segment was another crack spidering beneath his feet. And yet, instead of slowing down, instead of stepping back to safety, Hitler chose to run faster. This decision, born from ideology and desperation, set the stage for a transformation more radical than any financial policy in Europe's interwar history. The 4-year plan was the first open admission that Germany was preparing for war. Its purpose was brutally simple: make Germany economically ready to fight, regardless of the cost. Hermann Göring, a figure known more for flamboyant theatrics than economic expertise, was placed in charge. Many historians have criticized this choice. Göring had no financial training, but Hitler didn't want a technocrat. He wanted someone loyal, someone ruthless, someone willing to override every economic law in the name of reality. Göring embraced this role with absolute enthusiasm, building a bureaucracy so massive and chaotic that one scholar famously described it as a dictatorship within a dictatorship. Under Göring, the economy shifted from controlled capitalism to full-blown command economy. The state no longer simply guided production, it dictated it. Steel allocation, factory conversions, labor assignments, fuel distribution, everything became militarized. Germany's industrial giants, like Krupp AG, Farbon, and Messerschmitt, were pushed into a new relationship with the state. They were not fully nationalized, but they were no longer independent. Profit remained, but freedom vanished. Companies could not choose what to produce. They were told. They could not set their own priorities. They were ordered. They could not hire how they wished. Labor was assigned to them. The Nazi economy fused private industry with government command in a manner that still influences debates in economic history today. But here is the crucial lesson. This was not sustainable. No economy, especially one lacking resources, can maintain this tempo indefinitely. Germany was consuming raw materials faster than it could acquire them. Synthetic substitutes were expensive and inefficient. Stockpiles were running low. And those infamous Mefo Bills, those financial ghosts that hid the true cost of rearmament, were now maturing. Billions of Reichsmarks would soon need to be paid. Germany no longer had the luxury of waiting. War had gone from a political aim to an economic lifeline. This is the moment when Nazi strategy shifts from internal manipulation to external exploitation. And this is where the financial story of World War II becomes darker, sharper, and brutally revealing. When a regime cannot pay for its ambitions through normal means, it turns to plunder. Germany needed resources, foreign currency, food supplies, and labor. And the only place to get them was outside Germany. The annexation of Austria in 1938 demonstrated this perfectly. Many see it as a geopolitical move. Fewer understand its economic significance. Austria was not only a cultural and historic target, it was a financial jackpot. When German troops marched into Vienna, they did not just raise flags. They took over gold reserves, foreign currency, factories, railways, and banks. The Austrian National Bank was stripped of its reserves and absorbed into the Reich. Foreign exchange that Germany desperately needed was now at Hitler's disposal. Even more grotesquely, Jewish property was expropriated on a massive scale. Through laws and intimidation, enriching the state and its elites. Pause for a moment and think about this. The annexation of Austria instantly relieved many of Germany's most dangerous financial pressures. It brought fresh gold, foreign assets, industries, and labor into Nazi hands. This was not accidental. It was strategic. Plunder became policy. The annexation of Czechoslovakia in 1939 was even more economically significant. The Czech lands contained some of the most advanced industrial facilities in Europe, especially the Koda Works, which would soon become one of the largest armaments suppliers to the German war machine. Again, German forces didn't just occupy, they seized. The Czech National Bank was looted, and the country's gold reserves were transferred to Germany through the Bank for International Settlements. In a controversial and infamous episode, still debated by economists today, Czechoslovakia's arms factories, mines, and industries were seamlessly integrated into the German war economy. At this point, I want to ask you something directly. Because your perspective matters to this channel, do you think Germany would have dared wage war in 1939 if it had not first looted Austria and Czechoslovakia? Drop your thoughts below, because this question goes to the heart of how economic desperation shapes geopolitical aggression. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the pattern was unmistakable. War was not funded by savings or taxes or even loans. It was funded through conquest. Every new territory brought new assets that kept the system running a little longer. Polish banks were emptied. The zloty was manipulated and replaced. Agricultural production was requisitioned. Polish industrial workers were forced into German factories. And as always, Jewish property became a target of state-sanctioned theft on a massive scale. The exploitation grew more systematic with each expansion. When Germany invaded Western Europe, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Denmark, and Norway, it acquired some of the wealthiest, most industrialized economies in Europe. France alone paid enormous occupation costs, amounting to billions of Reichsmarks annually. These payments did not simply support the German army in France. They funded the entire Reich's war effort. The French treasury, factories, railways, mines, and agricultural lands were turned into economic engines for Nazi war ambitions. This is one of the most critical, yet least understood facts of World War II. The German economy during the war was not self-financing, it was parasitic. It survived by draining occupied Europe. Without the resources of conquered nations, the Nazi economy would have collapsed by 1940. The German home front survived only because millions of Europeans were forced to starve, surrender their wages, or labor under occupation. The war machine was paid for in stolen currency, stolen coal, stolen steel, stolen grain, and stolen lives, and nowhere was this exploitation more catastrophic than in the Soviet Union. When Germany invaded the USSR in 1941, It did not do so merely for ideological reasons. It did so because the Reich believed that only the vast agricultural lands and oil fields of the East could sustain a German empire capable of standing against Britain and the United States. Operation Barbarossa was as much an economic gambit as a military campaign. The hunger plan, drawn up by Nazi bureaucrats, openly planned the starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens so that German soldiers and German civilians could eat. It is one of the most horrifying economic documents in modern history. An explicit blueprint for genocide driven by resource needs. The occupation of Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Belarus brought Germany enormous quantities of grain, livestock, coal, and oil, at least temporarily. Soviet factories were dismantled and shipped east before Germans arrived. But mines and agricultural regions fell under Nazi control. Millions of Soviet citizens were deported as forced laborers to fill German factories emptied by conscription. The economic exploitation of the East was brutal, chaotic, and ultimately, but its intention was clear. Germany hoped to transform the Soviet Union into a colonial resource empire, a German India that would fuel its war machine indefinitely. But this strategy contained a fatal flaw. Germany had built an economy that required constant expansion to survive. The moment expansion stopped, collapse began. And expansion stopped not because Hitler changed his mind, but because resistance hardened and military reality shifted. The German war machine encountered deep strategic limits in the Soviet Union. Logistics broke down. Supply lines stretched across thousands of kilometers. The winter of 1941 shattered the illusion of invincibility. And as the Wehrmacht faltered, so did the economic engine behind it. By 1942, despite massive territory under control, the Reich was once again facing shortages. Oil production was insufficient. Synthetic fuel plants struggled. Transportation networks were overburdened. Bombing raids intensified. Labor shortages became critical, forcing Germany to rely more heavily on forced labor from occupied territories, men, women, and even children dragged from their homes and shipped to German factories under brutal conditions. The cost of occupation rose. Resistance movements sabotaged railways, bridges, and supply depots. Partisan warfare forced Germany to commit troops and resources to rear security instead of the front. And most importantly, the United States entered the war, bringing with it economic power on a scale Germany could not hope to match. American industry produced more tanks, planes, ships, and ammunition than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The balance of economic power shifted, and with it, the fate of the war. Germany attempted increasingly desperate measures to sustain its economy. It issued more debt. It printed more money. It squeezed occupied nations harder. It extended working hours. It rationed more strictly. It increased the use of synthetic alternatives. But none of it compensated for the staggering losses on the Eastern Front and the relentless Allied bombing campaign. From 1943 onward, Germany was no longer running an economy in motion. It was running an economy in collapse. The Reichsbank's vaults dwindled. Gold reserves shrank. Foreign currency evaporated. Transportation networks crumbled. Entire industrial districts were bombed into rubble. The miracle of rearmament had become a nightmare of shortages, chaos, and fear. Let me ask you here, because I want you to think like a strategist, do you believe any economic system can survive if it is built on constant expansion and plunder? Or is collapse inevitable the moment expansion stops? Share your thoughts in the comments. These discussions help build a community of critical thinkers. By 1944, Germany was surviving only on momentum and terror. The economy was propped up by coercion, propaganda, and the hope of miracle weapons that could turn the tide. But no miracle could compensate for the enormous structural weaknesses that had been there from the beginning. The same Mefo Bills that once financed rearmament now symbolized the illusion of Nazi financial stability. Billions in debt, owed to companies whose factories were now in ruins or under enemy occupation, stood as proof that this system had never been viable in peacetime. The final collapse came in the winter of 1944-45. As Allied armies pushed into Germany from both east and west, The Nazi economic system fell apart. Factories shut down, mines flooded, transport collapsed, food supplies vanished. The government resorted to printing money in massive quantities, reviving the ghost of hyperinflation. Civilians scavenged for wood to heat their homes. Urban populations fled. And the war machine, the once unstoppable force, ground to a halt. Germany surrendered in May 1945, not only because its armies were defeated, but because its entire economic foundation had disintegrated. What began as a daring financial experiment using secret credit and political manipulation had ended in the largest economic disaster in modern European history. And the lesson is unmistakable. No empire, no matter how fierce its armies or how charismatic its leader, can escape the laws of economics forever. Now that you've heard the full story, I want you to reflect on something important. Think about the world we live in today. Think about how nations use resources, debt, influence, and expansion. Think about how economies can look powerful on the surface while hiding deep structural weaknesses underneath. What lessons do you think the rise and fall of the Nazi economic system teaches us about modern global powers? Comment your thoughts, because your insights help guide the next documentaries we produce on this channel. If you found value in this two-part deep dive, if it challenged your understanding or opened your eyes to the economic forces behind World War II, then take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more powerful, factual stories that help you see the world more clearly. Your support helps us continue producing high-quality historical content. And we have many more untold financial stories coming next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.